to grips over the last few months of really what this is all about and how it came to be and why it's so important. So at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about thinking to the future for Tsunami Hikoi Week. But this is something that I'm also interested to hear what everybody thinks about it and what they think the future might be as well, because it's really, this has been a community-led initiative from the start, and it's important, I think, to hear from all sides of the community, particularly the science community, about where they think the role of this is and how it expands as well. Also, I talk really fast, so just flag me if I'm talking too quickly. So, as I say, Tsunami Hikoi Week. So, in a nutshell, what Tsunami Hikoi Week is a walk to your tsunami safe location. And it surrounds the anniversary of the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami that caused the meltdown of the Fukushima power plant and claimed the lives of about 15,500 people just from the tsunami alone. And so it's something that we've hosted. It was something that was created by East Coast Lab, but it's since then become attached to other initiatives like Shakeout. So the national Shakeout that comes up in October this year. So NEMA advertises that, but they also attach Tsunami Hikoi Week to it and sort of tie them up together because they're really good. There are two things that work very well together. You get people practicing their drop cover hold for if an earthquake was long or strong. But in New Zealand, because of where we live, and because of the likelihood of tsunami, if you're doing that, you probably also want to be thinking about your long, strong get gone and heading up a hill. If anything's strong enough to knock you off your feet or lasting a while that you're going, I should probably get under my desk. It's about driving home the message that should always be tied up, if you're at the coast, by an evacuation to your tsunami safe location. The reason that we're so focused on it here on the East Coast, and the reason the East Coast Lab exists in the first place, is because we're all about life at the boundary, so the boundary of our tectonic plate boundary. So we have, and this is probably not news to most of you, but we have the Hikurangi subduction zone sitting just off of our coast. And so East Coast Lab was really created to make sure that there was a continued research focus that was well coordinated, and also that there was engagement with the community and with emergency managers in the area as well. So that we were always keeping a focus on this particular hazard. As you know, I got whisked away to deal with cyclone stuff. And so when emergency managers are always getting tied up in other activities like that, literally pretty much always putting out fires, that sort of thing, it makes it really hard to make a lot of consistent progress on one specific really major hazard. And so, which is changing now as NEMA is growing, but the East Coast Lab was brought in to make sure that that focus could stay on. So how do we begin? So the first ever, what we could call a Tsunami Hikoi, was actually not done by East Coast Lab at all. It was set up by the EMO of the Hastings District Council and linked in with the Get Ready, Get Through messaging of emergency management. They set up a project called Get Ready, Get Through the Vines. So out at Tiawonga, out along the Hastings coast, there's a lot of vineyards and there's a lot of communities that are really vulnerable to tsunami because they sit right on that coast, and they're really vulnerable to actually a lot of coastal hazards because, as we know, sea levels are rising and that's impacting those communities a lot. So this was put together as just a community walk to head through the vines up to the nearest hill and just practice that tsunami evacuation for this particularly vulnerable community. And then it was reviewed by some scientists from GNS, so by Graham Leonard and I actually can't remember the other person's name, I'm sorry. So they were contracted in to do a review of this exercise, and they actually found in this report that this is an excellent form of education. This is one of the best ways that we can get people remembering where the tsunami safe zone is and really driving it home that that's something that they need to know, so that in a real event, they can move quickly, they can immediately know where we're going, and they don't waste any time. But it's important that it's something that should be done regularly and not just as a one-off, to sort of make it part of people's just general knowledge. And then the point was kind of proven very, very soon after. So that was in the December of 2010. And then in March of 2011, of course, we had the major Japan tsunami and earthquake. So as much as it's, it was an extraordinary loss of life. 15,500 people was, it was an incredible tragedy. But importantly, that's only, so 5%, about 5% of the population. So 95% of the people in the inundated zone survived. And that's because they knew to evacuate immediately. There's a really strong culture of preparedness in Japan, particularly to tsunamis, because there's such a remembered history of them, much more than there is in Aotearoa. So because of that, people knew, and there's actually been other initiatives. So it's not just something that's sort of widely known; it is something that's practiced. And when there has been drills in the past, the guidance has been around immediate self-evacuation and about looking after only yourself and just thinking, I need to go immediately. I'm not going to mess around wasting time. So this tsunami came from a subduction zone very similar to our own, which is why we use this as such a close comparison for what we need to be prepared for as well. And yeah, so we basically, the amount of survival comes down to a really strong culture of preparedness, and that's clearly something that we haven't had as much of in New Zealand, and something that we need to work towards. So the first Tsunami Hikoi, again, there was the project that was done with Get Through the Vines, and then Civil Defence and East Coast Lab went out to a local marae and was talking about possibly doing one of those out at the marae and having this be the first proper walk. And they were talking about the tsunami evacuation walk. And a woman named Rosa Hiha said, "Oh, you mean like a hikoi?" And so from then, the term Tsunami Hikoi just kind of really organically took on this life and became the phrase that we used for it. And then Kate Borson, I'd say my predecessor, decided to run this as an annual event and use it to both mark the 2011 Japan earthquake, and to just have a reason and have an anchor point that people can always remember as relating to the Tsunami Hikoi week. This photo is not from the first Tsunami Hikoi. We had another project that I'll talk a little bit about later, but we had a school in Waimarama School, which is really small. I think they've got about 30 kids, 20 to 30 kids. And so we had a photographer come out and photograph the work that we were doing with them. And so we have these really adorable photos of all the kids going up the hill. So why walk? So when we encourage people to do the Tsunami Hikoi, it's important that we always encourage that it is a walk, and it's not a drive or anything else. So you can kind of see in these photos, these are from previous tsunami evacuations or when warnings have been issued, tsunami warnings have been issued. And it's pretty clear that, that there is an issue here, that there's an enormous amount of congestion. In Japan, we know that the guidance there always tells people to travel on foot so that congestion isn't an issue. And even in some areas, traveling by vehicle during a tsunami evacuation is prohibited. So obviously that's easier to enforce during a drill than in a real scenario, but it means that people always know that they don't travel by vehicle. So there's a couple of reasons for this. So one is congestion, which impacts everybody. But also if you're traveling on foot, you're preventing congestion for everyone, but it means that those who don't have an option, people who have to travel by vehicle, which might be people with disabilities or elderly people, or even emergency services, people who want to move their equipment out of the tsunami zone so that then they can return to help afterwards. They need those roads to be cleared so that they can move through. And on top of just cars piling up, after a long or strong earthquake, there could be significant damage to the roads. That means that they are impassable anyway. So people are actually wasting time by trying to get in their vehicle and move. It might actually slow them down. This guidance sounds a little bit harsh, and particularly in rural areas. I know here in Hawke's Bay, in some communities, that just doesn't make sense. Particularly, we have a lot of really rural communities. It's going to be faster and it's going to be more effective for them perhaps to move by vehicle. But certainly in the town, I'm in Napier right now looking out towards the coast. And if anybody here tried to travel in their car up Hospital Hill, you would immediately have this insane amount of congestion. That would be really, really dangerous. Yeah, so essentially that's what it's all about is traveling on foot. We also tell people that they can use agile vehicles, so things like bikes and motorbikes. And whenever we say this, people always go, well, I'm going to get in my car because I want to get out fast. And as much as I completely understand the urge to do that, if it was myself and my partner, I could imagine the urge to do that. But you're actually possibly just slowing yourself down. We also find people doing things like trying to put petrol in their car before they evacuate. Can be really, really dangerous because actually they've only got about 15 minutes before a tsunami wave arrives. So wasting that precious time can have really dire consequences. So Hikoi in schools. So this is something, so a Hikoi isn't just something that we do with school groups, although it works very well in school groups. It's something that we encourage everybody to do, moving from their home, moving from their workplace with their whānau. It's just something that we encourage people to do, but it works well in schools. And it's also really important because not only do the kids then know where to go, but if we're doing it all the time and we're encouraging schools to do it, it means they're also working on their tsunami evacuation plan, which is good for two reasons in terms of survival. So one, in Japan, because there was such an excellent level of preparedness amongst schools, of all the people who died in the tsunami, only 75 of those people were children who were in the care of their teachers. And 74 of those were at exactly one school that didn't know to evacuate. So this one school, it was a terrible tragedy. This one school had an evacuation plan that if there was an earthquake, they would move out onto the field. So they all did that, but there was no follow-up for a tsunami evacuation. A few kids self-evacuated, but many of them didn't. And as a result, 74 children at that school lost their lives. So when we have schools practicing and they understand this information and they know the story behind the Tsunami Hikoi as well, it makes sure that they're always remembering that this is something that's important for them to have a really strong tsunami evacuation plan and that all the teachers know what to do. And then it's also important for their parents. So a lot of parents and caregivers lost their lives in the tsunami in Japan because they were returning to the school to collect their children, most of which, as we can see from the numbers, had already actually evacuated and were safe. And so that meant that people were putting themselves at risk when if they had known and been able to trust school and felt safe in the knowledge that their kids would be evacuated and that they would know where to go and collect them from in a tsunami safe area, they wouldn't have been in that position. So this is the project that I was talking about that we did with the school. And I am realizing I'm actually going to finish this talk really, really fast. But I really want everyone to sort of have questions and talk about perhaps how it might work in your area or initiatives you've thought of ways that you could sort of tie this in with your work, because it's something that we're working on as well. So the other project that we worked on was the Tsunami Po, or the Tsunami Tomato project. So this was done in partnership with two schools. So one in Hawke's Bay, which was Waimarama School, and another in Tairāwhiti, which was Wainui School. Waimarama is a beautiful, beautiful school. It's literally built on sand dunes, basically. The edge of their courts are actually like heading onto the sand dunes. It's an awesome school with awesome staff and awesome kids. And what they did is they designed these 3 posts, so these 3 markers that they could install at the top of their tsunami evacuation zone. So that kids would always know where to go, and they always have a place. They know how high they need to be, and it's a constant reminder as well of the risk. So people are always aware. If I feel a long or strong earthquake, I've seen that up there. I know that's how high I need to get, and I know that an evacuation is something that's required. It was also really co-created with the kids. So the kids came up with designs, which you can see on the Po, and when it was installed and it was blessed, they read their stories about what it all meant, and it was amazing. And they were talked about how we know that tsunamis have happened in the past, about moving together. So one of their symbols was about moving together collectively to make sure that everybody that we're looking after everyone, we're taking everyone with us, and that we're safe together, and that it's safe when we can move together. It was this really cool experience, and the kids have these installed, and I've gone up and walked the track a couple of times. Yeah, and it's something that they really value. So that's keeping that constant reminder as well, so that those kids as well, when they grow up in that area, are going to keep that message going. And the Tairāwhiti one I haven't gone to see, but I was sent a picture by someone who rode up on their horse. So I know that it's accessible by multiple ways. So this one is on the Papakainga, across the street from the school, and across the street from the local marae as well. And the one in Tairāwhiti is behind the school as well. So it might not be something that's appropriate for everybody in that area to try and get up to. It's not a huge area, but what it is it's a sign to people of how high they need to go as well to escape a tsunami wave. And then finally, the future of the Tsunami Hikoi. So as I say, I don't have notes here because I think Tsunami Hikoi is something that has evolved best when it's been community led. So that's what we'll be working on over the next year, is looking at what are ways that we can expand this. We can get alongside schools and we can bring in new projects like Tsunami Po, but it's about going out to the community and understanding what they think is the next best thing. We're tying things up with Shakeout. So this year's Shakeout, you will see advertising about Tsunami Hikoi as well. If you're doing it in your workplace or in your home, or your kid's school is doing it, make sure that they're also following that shakeout up with a Tsunami Hikoi if they are in an evacuation zone. So I am interested to hear from everybody if you have any questions, or just what you sort of think of the Tsunami Hikoi and where you might see that going, or how you might apply that in your community. As I say, a bit of a speedy one, but I really appreciate everybody listening, so thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Georgia. That was, short and sweet, but don't feel bad about that at all. I mean, efficiency of communication is key, particularly with risk communication. So
if I spoke at the speed of a normal person, would have been here for half an hour. So
I'm sure that's not true. Thank you. That was wonderful. There's a very manageable group here today. So anyone who has a question for Georgia, please unmute yourself and go right ahead. Oh, I've got a comment from Susan. Well communicated. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you, Susan.
Well, I'll kick us off then. So I lived in Japan for 3 years, which was very exciting for me, and also quite a challenge because there's a lot of cultural differences, obviously, between Japanese culture and New Zealand. It's particularly regimented. Teaching there is a dream because students, there's 40 students in a classroom and they all behave. But yeah, can you comment on, obviously it works really well there. How much of that do you think might be cultural, and what challenges do you see there in trying? I mean, obviously, like you said, our first instinct, if we want to go somewhere fast, is to jump in the car.
Yeah.
Overcoming that is a huge challenge, and it will be, I think, especially for Kiwis, because we're so used to it and we don't really do public transport compared to other countries.
Completely. And there's actually a whole lot of cultural things that really massively come into play. So, I mean, one of them is, and a sense that particularly kids and people in school follow rules. And so that was one of the unfortunate outcomes, was that school where they evacuated onto the lawn, no teacher was willing to say, okay, we need to go up the hill. And I'm not blaming them for the situation. They were also really far inland. They certainly didn't think that they would have been in that situation. Whereas some schools in New Zealand might have been more willing to sort of just pick up and run, or not follow a guidance, which is the other reason that we could possibly have more of an issue, is people not necessarily knowing, or kind of wanting to sort of commit to following through a plan if they don't think that it's accurately reflecting their situation. And while a strong earthquake is a really good signal for people, a long one might not be. So people might not be as familiar that actually, if we have just like a gentle rolling but a really long one, that still could be a sign that we're about to have a tsunami. The other thing is that lived culture. So that cultural understanding in Japan comes from hundreds of years of experience. And what the Po project actually came out of was, in Japan, there are these enormous stones. They're not everywhere, but in a few communities, there's these enormous, like 10 feet tall stones that have carved into them stories saying things like, one of the most obvious ones says something along the lines of, remember the calamity of the great tsunami and don't build below this line. So there really was like physical markers saying, remember this story. This was bad. and it also is something that people have passed down over generations. Grandparents can say to their grandchildren, I lived through this. And if you feel this, you need to go and you need to do this. We haven't had that so much in New Zealand. We had some pretty large tsunami in 1947 in Gisborne, but in an almost entirely unpopulated area. There were a couple of people, one survived their house being fully inundated, and a couple of others, it was a great novelty to find fish washed up on their paddocks later. And so it was, it wasn't this great disaster that would be these days in the Gisborne urban area. But because of that, people don't have that lived experience. We know earthquakes, but we don't necessarily know tsunami quite as well. So that's a challenge that we're working against. And it's part of why we want to use science as East Coast Lab to sort of build that narrative, get people really familiar with it. Because when you kind of come in and you say, oh, there's this big scary thing and we need to do something about it, when will it happen? Maybe in the next 500 years. it's, or the next, in this case, we actually have some really strong evidence now that there's a 25% chance in the next 50 years, or sorry, 26% chance that in the next 50 years, we will have a massive Hikurangi subduction zone earthquake, based on the record of paleo tsunamis and paleo earthquakes. So, but even that's quite a hard thing to drill home, is the idea that maybe someday something really big's going to happen and we're going to have to prepare for it. You've never seen it before, but trust me, that's quite a hard message. And it's also really scary. And when people are afraid, they don't prepare because it feels like it's too big, it feels like it's too hard basket, it's something that we can't deal with. So if instead we can connect people with the science, get them learning and understanding so they retain the knowledge of how tsunamis are made, what earthquakes do, that kind of thing, then the preparedness kind of follows on from that as well. And it helps to create that cultural understanding as well, and it sticks in people's brains rather than shutting it down with just the scary stuff. And finally the car thing. Everybody in New Zealand, we just like cars. We're very much a car-driven society. We don't tend to do a lot of walking places. When petrol went up, my partner and I started walking the 2 blocks to the supermarket. We were like, wow, you can do this. It's a thing. You can walk places, and so it is something that we're really just not used to, and people are afraid for their families, and also their cars are sometimes their biggest asset. They don't want to leave that behind. It's valuable to them. So there's a lot of things for people to sort of reckon with when they know that that's something that they might have to leave behind or a different way. So there's quite a few barriers, but it's all things that we work towards over time. And again, that's why coming from the community is so important, because understanding why people feel that way. I think there's sort of this, if you kind of go on and you'd be like, well, just leave your car behind. That's never going to work for people, where you need to find other ways to communicate and connect before delivering that kind of a message.
Cool. Thank you, Georgia. Does anyone else have any questions?
Oh, I see Lorna on here. Hi, Lorna.
No? Oh, I'm going to follow up with, I thought of a couple more while you were talking. So obviously, big tsunamis in New Zealand are not in anybody's kind of lived experience. And New Zealand doesn't have a human history anywhere near as long as Japan. But we do have, obviously, Mātauranga Māori, which, and I understand there are some projects around the country currently going on looking at kind of Maori folk tales and mythology to look for evidence of past tsunami that have been passed down through the oral tradition. Is that something you are involved in or are collaborating with?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's something that that in the past has been worked through. So when we've had big science projects, part of that has been devoting funds to looking into Mātauranga Māori, because as you say, that's our lived proof, that's our evidence of things that happened. We haven't had enormous Hikurangi subduction zone events that have necessarily made it into the human record necessarily, but it's still something that's been used, and it's most effective when it starts from iwi, and when that partnership is really built, and you can hand over and say, okay, we're not just sort of coming in and saying, can you tell us something? It's about, okay, what does this mean to you? How do we build something that's valuable to you, so that knowledge is kept with the people who it belongs to, and they have ownership over the way that knowledge is communicated, and how far it goes as well. That's intellectual property. So it's also about working together to get something that's of value to everybody and can be shared widely, but also retains intellectual property of the people sharing it. I'm reading this book, which is a very good book, Tikanga, and there's a good line in there that I like. This is, sharing is good, but sharing doesn't mean giving away. And so it's about building those partnerships with the science projects to be able to share that knowledge.
Yeah, definitely. Sort of maintaining kind of data sovereignty is something that's very much to the fore. On the logistics front of running like a Tsunami Hikoi, I know back when there was the tsunami warning March.
Yeah. Oh gosh, it's like May now. Oh my gosh, the day.
I know.
Not this much been with the one before.
Yeah. So obviously people, I believe they were up on the hills and things for several hours, much longer than maybe they anticipated. Is that something you build into the Tsunami Hikoi, or is it very much, yay, we made it and then we go home? Or do you encourage people to consider the fact that they might be up there for a very long time and they should have a grab bag of supplies that they should bring with them? Like, could you tell us a little bit more about kind of the nitty-gritty details?
Totally. So it would be something that we want people to consider. And a lot of our messaging we'd talk about, and particularly the civil defence messaging, is around what you take with you and having something in, particularly in workplaces. When we do it here, my office is based out of the Hawke's Bay Regional Council. Everyone takes their grab bag from under their desk to just prepare them for that. Even putting on your running shoes before you go, just those things that prepare you to think about, okay, how long is this taking me? Do I have actually everything that I need in this bag for if I had to be, as you say, stuck up there for quite a while? And as well, we use the language of, we can expect a tsunami within 15 to 50 minutes of a long or strong earthquake. So that people also know that if they get up there and 20 minutes have gone by and there's no tsunami, that it's time to head on home and just carry on with the day, because that's also something that we have some concerns around. And it was awesome to see that in the March tsunami evacuation, people did stay up there for a long time, which is really, really promising. And as well, there is some research going into the March tsunami evacuations and what we learned from those, particularly with the schools up on the East Cape. So it'd be really interesting to see what they learn, to see how we can build that into our messaging as well, and see what made it such a successful event and maybe in some places not so successful.
From the limited research I've done on, things that help kind of people's building cognitive connections and memory, like Tsunami Hikoi seems to have all the things. They're out in the fresh air, they're getting exercise, they're doing it with a community, it's hitting all the bases, right? So yeah, it's obviously proving to be a successful initiative, and I wish you every success going forward. Thank you so much.